Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Passion from Pain. This isn't the place for safe stories or soft edges. This is where truth meets power. We believe your pain isn't a weakness, it's the very force that shapes your strength. Each episode, we honor those who have faced the darkness, stood their ground, and turned their battles into breakthroughs. And today we have a guest who knows that journey firsthand. We miss Romilly Golding, author of 21 Red Flags. Thank you so much, Romilly, for visiting us today. I'm so excited to have you on the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Amy. So lovely to be here. Thanks very much for that powerful introduction. Yeah, so I'm based in the UK and really privileged to be on your show. I'm a relationship recovery coach and author of 21 Red Flags, Spotting the Signs of an Unhealthy Relationship. And I've also recently qualified as an ecstatic dance DJ. So I integrate somatic dance into my methodologies and like healing work as well, but we'll save that for later in the show.
I love that. I love that. A somatic dance healing instructor. What is that? What does that look like? What do we do in those courses?
Yeah, so ecstatic dance is, I find it like a healing modality, and it's becoming more popular. It's kind of in the same vein as like conscious clubbing or day raves or things like that, which are kind of popping up in cities around the world. And so the ecstatic dance is like a safe space. It often starts with like a ceremony or a meditation. It's done in a group. You have a DJ, which is now going to be me, who takes the group on like a really good sound journey, like a very meaningful and intentional sound journey. And it's really a space for personal expression. And there are quite strict rules around, it's for personal space. You don't actually talk during the dance. There's no hitting on people, etc. So it's very safe. And it's a way to explore your feelings, explore your body, shake everything out, and have a really good time.
It sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to sign up because that sounds like, I don't know, it just sounds like so much fun, and a really great way to just, I don't know, let everything out. I love it. I love it. And so you've written the book 21 Red Flags, Spotting the Signs of an Unhealthy Relationship. And this comes from personal experience in your life, correct? Do you want to talk about that a little bit and how you got to writing this book?
Yeah, it comes from personal experience. It also comes from the experience of many, many women actually around me. And it comes from kind of a broader global community, because I must say the book took me about kind of 4 or even 5 years to write.
Wow.
So based on personal experience, and this is, as you know, as your show is called kind of Passion from Pain, I was really able at one point in those relationships to recognize that I was in one, recognize that I'd got into another one, and use that time in that relationship as a kind of case study. So I was able to observe what was going on. I was able to kind of more clinically look at patterns, and I was able to more kind of coldly recognize what was going on whilst keeping myself kind of also like emotionally safe. And then I used that learning afterwards to put all this in a kind of more structured way. And the book, actually, I never intended to be a nonfiction writer. My background is in writing, and I've been an English teacher, etc. as well. And I'm an editor. I thought I might be writing fiction, but this book kind of just downloaded itself to me. So it's a really practical guide. So it's 21 red flags, and I've deliberately chosen ones that I find are really overlooked and much more subtle. And we can go into that afterwards. And each chapter is structured into kind of understanding what the red flag is, how to spot the red flag, the impact on you. And then each chapter finishes with a kind of practical section called Taking Action. And that may be kind of power phrases or things to think about, or some kind of practical reflection, depending on the topic of the chapter.
That's amazing that you've got that piece into it, because you're not just reading the information, but there's actually something to do to help, get the information to stick, or to actually apply the information to your life, which is, where it's really going to be helpful. It's one thing to just read the information and kind of put the book down and kind of forget about it, but it's a whole other thing to actually apply it.
Yeah, I would say that I wrote the book that I couldn't find.
Yeah, I love it.
When I was in the middle of these relationships, I know other people who've gone through kind of similar. I'm a big reader. I'm into kind of personal development and self-growth, like I imagine a lot of your readers and listeners are. And so I was like seeking out information. And I remember going to a really large kind of bookstore in London and just looking for information on like unhealthy relationships or relationship dynamics. And I really couldn't find anything. I would say this was several years ago, before kind of the prevalence of maybe relationship toxicity and the adjacent fields of kind of narcissism and dark triads, etc., have emerged. But at the time, all I could see was kind of just couples guides, or at the other end of this spectrum, kind of books on psychopaths and narcissists, which just totally weren't in my realm. I didn't even look at, didn't even think were kind of related to my situation at all. And I really couldn't find anything that was speaking to me and kind of helping me make a decision on what was okay and what wasn't okay, you know, because I would say the main thrust for this book was the fact that I knew kind of something was off in all the relationships. And I think other women that I've researched and spoken to have said the same. You can't really put your finger on it, because many of these behaviors you're being subjected to are very covert and are very subtle. And I was just really desperately trying to find kind of validation or information about why this was feeling so off, and someone to explain to me what was going on.
Yeah, and you've really, kind of hit the nail on the head there, because it's really subtle, especially in the beginning there, and you feel like exactly like something is off. You can't put your finger on it, and the more the relationship progresses, you start to think that you're figuring it out, but then you're led to believe that you're the crazy one, that this isn't really what is going on. And that's part of the manipulation, from a narcissist or psychopath as well. That's part of their manipulation, is to get you to believe that you are the one with all the problems. And, it's so helpful to have books and information like this out there, so that you can validate the experience that you are having and understand that, maybe you're not the crazy one. Other people are experiencing this, and this is a real thing that you could be going through.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know about you, Amy, but I've had people who would say to me, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors, or you are idealizing everyone else's relationship, or, this is what marriages are like. And those kind of, well, they're actually gaslighting statements, which kind of make you think, are things so bad? Am I overreacting? Sometimes we do have good times. There are good times, and that's the tricky thing in these bad relationships. There can be really great times, right? Great times physically. You can laugh together. You can regain that sense of comfort. It feels really real. After after kind of a flare up, or a massive argument, or 4 weeks of stonewalling. The good times do come back, and they do feel real, and we're craving those bonds and that connection so much that does feel real. But it was only kind of later that I realized, in fact, the relationship, the litmus test of those relationships isn't the power of the good times. It's the fact that the bad times are there. And in fact, the good times are just masking the bad times, and that's the baseline.
So what do you think is, what would be the most glaring piece of, I don't know, evidence that would let somebody know if they are in fact dealing with, a narcissist or psychopath and in the bad times, as opposed to just dealing with normal bad times in a marriage? What do you think is the big difference, and what would let the listener or the audience know, like, hey, I am dealing with this, or what, maybe it is just normal marital problems?
Yeah. So I would say two things. So in the course of writing and researching the book, I was looking at abusive behaviors. And in fact, several years ago, I'd met up with a friend in London, and she was kind of brandishing a book and saying, oh, I'm leaving my husband because he's abusive. And I kind of thought, steady on, that's a really powerful word. Are you sure? Et cetera, right? having no kind of educational awareness at the time of what she meant. And so in the course of researching and writing the book, I was really looking really deeply at what constitutes kind of abusive behaviors. And I would say that there are two things. So obviously in a couple or in a kind of regular marriage, there's going to be flare-ups and we're going to lose our cool and maybe say things that we didn't mean, etc. But in a relationship that's really toxic, the two things are that there is kind of there is intent, there is kind of a kind of malicious intent, and also the key thing is that it's a pattern. It does keep happening. So a one-off every few years with a spat with, you know, a husband who is generally really lovely, and you guys both get into a fight, etc., and some heated words are exchanged. That is kind of, you know, par for the course. But a repeated cycle of, you know, nasty words, of contempt, of sabotage, of sulking, of walking on eggshells, of, you know, your friends being disparaged, of being constantly checked up on and monitored, is what is to look out for. And I would say that there's often real promises to change, right, in those cycles, in those roller coasters, in those kind of flare-ups. You know, you'll have I call it the trap cycle. Actually, you have the tension, you have the row, you have the attack, and then you have the promises again, and everything is kind of smoothed out. And in that, with those kind of promises, that's where, you know, promises are made, right? In terms of, we will change this, you know, we'll work this out. And something else I find, Amy, that was really insightful for me actually is recognizing that, and this might be useful for your listeners, so as well as the patterns, it's thinking about this idea that in a normal healthy relationship, you're communicating and your relationship is evolving and going on an upward spiral of evolution. But in a toxic relationship, it's cyclical and you're just cycling through the same old patterns again and again and again. They're not changing, they're stagnating, and actually over time they're getting worse. So you're looking for patterns and you're looking for cycles rather than one-offs and like a positive evolution.
It's really difficult to be able to pinpoint that sometimes, especially when, you know, they come back in with all of the promises and they put you back up on that pedestal because they know that's where, you know, they need to have you to kind of put you back under control. And so, you know, noticing those patterns and noticing that cycle is really what's going to save you essentially, or point all of this out, you know, for sure. You know, and I think it's that pedestal that we crave. Those of us who have been subject to abuse, we crave that, you know. It's something that we've been missing somewhere along the lines in our life, and you get that from somebody, you know, and you know, that's how we end up really falling for it, is that pedestal and those promises that are made but never kept.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add to that, if your listeners are picking up on this and considering that they may be in a cycle, I would say that as the relationship progresses over time and starts to degrade, that cycle gets shorter, and the times between the good times and the bad times start to get shorter. So it could go from like kind of 3 months, you may be noticing, oh, hang on, every 3 months, actually, we are starting to have a really big flare up. And that can reduce down to every 3 weeks. And by the end of one of my relationships, I could kind of time it by the day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. And, you know, I didn't know that, you know, that you could, that, wow, they did stick to like a time schedule, you know, of sorts. You know, I didn't realize that. That's really interesting.
I think it's conscious, but it's just, you know, the good times, they just don't stay. I think they kind of can't help themselves in terms of, you need to be just put back in your place, right? The calm and harmony can't stay. They need to kind of reassert their dominance and reassert their control, and that's when you'll find the nitpicking will start again, or the criticizing will start again, or a really nasty remark will come at you out of the blue, and then that would just kind of kickstart that cyclical pattern of abuse again.
Wow. So what are some of the biggest, most glaring red flags that we can let the listeners kind of know about, like, if you are seeing this habitually in your relationship, it's really time to start looking at, you could be in this situation.
Yeah, definitely. So my focus, I suppose, is on the more subtle red flags, because I think they get overlooked. And I would say that in domestic abuse campaigns or domestic violence campaigns that we see, in the States, in Australia, kind of in any country, actually, even I've lived in Europe, kind of France, etc. The campaigns are really similar, and they show, a guy who looks really fierce, and maybe a woman like cowering in the corner or something like that, which I really don't think is an accurate depiction of the prevalence and scale of like emotional abuse and coercive control that women go through. And because of that, because that's the narrative and those are the visuals that are presented to us, we don't see our realities reflected back to us. And I would say that it actually all happens, it's kind of the death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's the small little behaviors that make us feel as though we're crazy, but aren't kind of massive enough to think we should leave. Or when we say to a girlfriend, he's always criticizing me, or he doesn't seem to like my friends, or something like that. It just seems really innocuous. And when we say it out loud, it might seem silly, and we just can't seem to get any substance underneath it for someone to say that really doesn't sound good at all, right? If someone is, being physically assaulted, or there's a lot of verbal abuse, it's much easier to spot. So I would say some of the smaller and more subtle red flags to look out for is like a feeling of being on what one of my researchers and really great friends called as being on an invisible leash.
Okay.
You just feel as though you're being monitored in some way. You're being kind of surveilled. It might not be overt. They might not have a tracker on your car, although that does happen. It could just be like the check-ins and just a kind of feeling that you have to maybe curtail your freedom, that maybe after coffee with a friend, you shouldn't really then, go around the shops because you're kind of expected home, etc. So you're curtailing your own freedoms. That can also come in with what I call like check-ins, which are actually checkups. So kind of, hey, where are you? Which seems so innocuous, but in fact, if you're constantly kind of monitored throughout the day, you have this feeling of like surveillance that you need to kind of account for your time. And I think a slow erosion of your individual like space and time, just that feeling that you can't quite shake off, that you need to be accountable. So I would say really look out for that kind of dynamic creeping in. And then anything. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was going to just say that, that can also be kind of veiled in like this concern for you or this care for you. They could mask it that way as well, and that was my situation where, the over concern for my safety and my well-being, ended up being, the exact abuse that I was being subjected to, and so that's a perfect example of that right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Or they can say that they've got like major trust issues from their past, etc. And so they're still hangovers of that. And so they just like to know, or that we should always share. And that can also kind of creep into your social media and your private activity, your Facebook and LinkedIn and things like that. Questions around your privacy, like why do you need your own Facebook page? Why do you even need your own email account? We should have a joint account. If you've got your own email account, you must have something to hide. So I would say when it also starts to go into that kind of accusatory territory, those I think they're called like logical fallacies. You feel as though you're put on the back foot. Like obviously you don't have anything to hide if you have your own email account, but you're still kind of entitled to have your own old email account with all your old friends. In fact, if you're put on the spot, it feels quite hard to justify. So I would say if you find yourself feeling as though you're just like entangled all the time, or even you're kind of like in a court and having to defend yourself and getting your tongue tied, this is like the walking on eggshells scenario as well, having to defend yourself against accusations that come at you from nowhere that are difficult to justify and kind of do a number on your head, then there's something to look out for, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And it, yeah, it just can be so confusing, as well. You're trying to navigate through all of this, and you think that, man, they're just really concerned for me, but on the other end, they've got these other intents, and so, it can be damaging. It can be really, really confusing for you to really navigate through.
Yeah, definitely. And then I would say there's a couple of others actually that people may not actually recognize, but sleep sabotage is actually a key kind of toxic trait. So if you realize that your sleep is often disrupted, or you don't feel that you can ever rest, and that can turn up with people introducing kind of new routines, suddenly getting up at 5 a.m. and doing protein shakes, or like throwing open the curtains and doing a gym, workout, or insisting that they're watching kind of films with you in bed, for example, without kind of headphones, and saying, oh, it shouldn't disturb you, or it's on low. I would just say, pay attention to, are you getting enough rest? Because obviously on a more kind of, what's the word? I don't really want to say sinister, but on a more sinister scale, the more that we are actually deprived of rest and good sleep, etc., the more our mental capacities are impacted, and we can't actually think as straight.
For sure. Absolutely. And I never considered that one, but, I can absolutely see how that's, a red flag, or, an abusive trait. You have to have that rest. And if they're constantly interrupting it, yeah, you're not going to be fully there mentally, and it's just going to wear you down even more. And, you get to that feeling like, just kind of whatever, because you don't have the energy to deal with it.
Yeah. And I would also say for your listeners to be picking up on, there's actually like a feeling of when someone doesn't allow you to rest, or is not kind of cherishing you, and we get the feeling that, does this person actually care for me and my well-being? In fact, underlying that is contempt. And that's one of the 4 kind of relationship horsemen of the apocalypse. That's from the John and Julie Gottman Marriage Institute.
Oh, wow.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in relationships is contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, and criticism.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And relationships and marriages cannot come back from those.
Wow. Yeah. That's definitely something that all of you need to look into. This is the first time I've heard of that, and I'm going to research it and look into it more after this, because I think that's an incredible piece of information that's really going to help. And that's what is the book again?
Yeah, so there's an institute run by a married, they're American psychotherapists. So it's John and Julie Gottman, so Gottman, I think, or maybe double N.
Okay.
And they coined this term, which is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So once again, it's contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, and criticism. So if they are continually present and your partner is just kind of not getting over them, they can spot fairly quickly if those traits are present, then the relationship is kind of doomed. But I would also say that, this is where the very lonely feeling comes in. When you're in these relationships, you have a real feeling of loneliness and isolation, and you just know that at the core of what's supposed to be like a really loving marriage or connection, there's no actual kind of warmth or empathy. There's no kernel of warmth at the center. It doesn't feel like a safe place. It doesn't really feel like home. You don't feel held. You don't feel cherished, because there is this thread of contempt, probably, even if people haven't put that word to it before, feeling that you can't really be kind of let up, or they've said something pretty nasty to you, or they know they've said, oh, you're sleeping too much, or,
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And so do you think that these types of people target certain individuals for these relationships, or do you think that they just develop some sort of hatred or contempt for the individual that they're with, and these red flags or symptoms just tend to develop due to the relationship? and the compatibility of the individuals in it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's really multi-layered, multifaceted, and really nuanced. I fundamentally believe that people who are behaving in a toxic way have kind of maladaptive behaviors. And so at their own core, I think often you'll find that these toxic individuals have had some kind of traumatic childhood, etc., or have been kind of golden child in a kind of narcissistic dynamic, etc. But whatever the background and whatever the case, the way they're behaving is a kind of maladaptive coping mechanism to kind of make them feel better. So I think it's a two-way dance, actually, unless we are really aware to our own behaviors, to our own patterns, and where we are potentially, would I say, lacking or maybe need to do a bit of work on ourselves. That's where we get this kind of toxic mix, and we kind of get enmeshed and so bonded in these relationships because each partner is actually getting something quite toxic out of, or we are reinforcing something, or it feels really familiar to us in these relationships. And I would say that equally, people often who get in those relationships, perhaps the empaths, perhaps the women, etc., often also have kind of a part that has been lacking. There is a theory actually that we partner with people in an attempt to repair and heal our own past traumatic relationships, perhaps with a parent, or if we've had abuse ourselves, etc. And so these not very nice relationships actually feel really familiar. And on some kind of level, unconsciously, we're thinking we'll be in this relationship and it will give us a chance to heal it and to heal those wounds and to heal those old patterns. But in fact, it is a little bit backwards, and we need to do the healing first and then get into a whole and healthy relationship, rather than not two toxic individuals, but maybe two slightly damaged individuals actually in their own way coming together and trying to create something.
You know, like in my past, you know, of course I had this traumatic upbringing, you know, and so of course it led me into one, you know, narcissistic relationship after another, because I was attracted to that, you know, through nothing that I absolutely knew about. But it just happened to be, you know, it was what it was. Those were the people that I attracted for whatever reason. But it was something about them that, you know, I saw in them that, you know, drew me to them. But it wasn't until, of course, I did that work on myself and learned about all of the things that I was missing in my own life, you know, emotionally and spiritually and whatnot, that I could work on those things and move forward to finally heal. And then I could, you know, attract the right people in my life and finally learn and understand what that true unconditional love really is supposed to look like and feel like. And so, you know, but that's the really difficult thing, you know, is once you've been in these relationships and you know, you're doing this work on yourself. Okay. And so now you're looking at, can I get into another relationship again? How do I trust that I'm going to be making the right decisions in partners moving forward? You know, looking at my track record hasn't been so great so far. How can I trust that after doing the healing work, what is that going to look like for me? How am I going to know that I've made the right decisions moving forward? You know?
I definitely think a bit of space is needed once we've exited a toxic relationship in order for us to get back to ourselves and know who we are again. And that can take a little while. I'm not saying it's taking years and years. I think it probably could take a year or 2 years. Sure. Because also we often need to kind of somatically and psychically heal from the assault of these. Sorry,
no, we're good.
Yeah,
we're good. We're good.
Yeah, it takes us a while, I think, to heal ourselves psychically on a soul level from those relationships and recognize what happened to us. There is a grieving process as well.
Mhm.
And for us to, it can be quite difficult and quite daunting to kind of fully accept what we've been through, especially as you said, you might have had a few of these relationships, and it even might have been a continuation from one's childhood as well. So there's
Sure.
that. But also, I do believe once you have done some of the waking up, it can actually be a really beautiful process of getting to know yourself again. And it can be a really beautiful process of self-love, self-discovery. I think definitely, you know, so I don't want your listeners to think, oh, crumbs, I've got like 5, 10 barren years ahead of me where I have to keep doing this work, right? I think it's holding both things, right? Healing. No one is ever fully 100% healed anyway, right? So you're holding the healing that you're doing also with this journey of self-discovery and self-love and who am I and what do I actually like, and kind of testing new boundaries and testing new ways of being. And I think it's really important to find and reclaim some of the parts of you that you've lost and that you gave up, or that were silenced or suffocated. So whether, or also just new like dimensions of yourself, you know, dancing, singing, changing your job, just being different at home, all kinds of ways in which you can find yourself again.
Yeah, for sure, you know, and goodness, it just takes experimenting to figure out what that is. You know, if you've never knew who that person was to begin with, you know, some of us, you know, never knew who we were, you know, raised in narcissism and you know, mental or emotional abuse. You just don't know, you know, you're told who you are. And so to finally discover who you are in your, you know, midlife, you know, is you know, it's an interesting thing to go through for sure, but it's a really cool thing to go through at the same time, you know. And there's so much you can do, so much you
Yeah.
can do.
Yeah, that's really deep. Yeah, because it often is midlife, right? And we often do have a reckoning, and we've got teenagers or children. And I think often something that can be quite sad or difficult to deal with is often these relationships, we're not ourselves, and so we mold and bend to the other person. So maybe we've brought up our kids in a much kind of stricter way than we would have done before, and so we may have some healing to do around that, etc. But yeah, there's definitely not too late, right? And then we have wisdom to move forward.
Oh, for sure. You know, I had a client of mine. She was 73 years old, and she was finally going through her healing journey. And you know, she was just a joy to have in the group. You know, but yeah, at 73 she was finally deciding to heal from her childhood wounds that had you know, just kind of encroached on her life and her marriages throughout her life. And she decided that in her golden years she wasn't going to allow it to you know, just consume her life anymore. And she was finally going to discover who she was. And you know, she was getting out there and taking art classes and doing a ton of stuff for herself to finally learn who she was at 73 years old. And it was a really cool thing to watch and see her go through. And so yeah, it's never too late. But we often find that, you know, we hit this point in our midlife, and I don't know if it's a midlife crisis kind of thing, like, you know, here, well, man, my life is half over, and you know, crap, I've just dealt with one crappy situation after another, and you know, is there any happiness? And I think we get to that point at this time in our life, and you know, we're like, I gotta find it, I gotta find it. And I don't know, something inside us wakes up at that point. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it can also like catalyze us, propel us forwards at greater speed, actually, because we're more determined. And then there's also the concept of post-traumatic growth as well. So people may have heard of post-traumatic stress, etc., but there is post-traumatic growth where you are then entering into this new era. That's what it's called.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a wonderful concept. I think I like that. I think I like that a lot. So, yeah, you know, in just exploring new things, you know, obviously educating yourself on, you know, the traumas that you've been through and healing journeys, and you know what it's going to take to kind of overcome the emotional abuse and the narcissistic abuse. I don't know, what other advice do you have out there for anybody who's overcoming from these situations that they've dealt with their whole lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things. If people have recently left that kind of relationship, then there's different levels in which you'll need to kind of find safety again. So I would say finding safety in your immediate environments. Maybe you've had to move back in with your parents. Maybe some people are in a shelter. Maybe you're in a one-bedroom apartment, etc. But finding safety in your home environment, I think, is important. Finding safety kind of emotionally as well, and just being able to check in with your emotions. Having kind of practical, like taking the time and getting the support to reset up potentially your practical systems around you to hold you. So maybe that's, maybe you haven't worked for a long time, maybe it's going from part-time to full-time or vice versa, just having a support network around you, just making sure that that kind of infrastructure is in place. And then I would say the fourth piece is like somatic safety and learning how to regulate yourself and your body, and being aware of, because we often actually have a kind of hangover of physical effects, right? There's many, many women who actually develop kind of mystery illnesses after being subject to such a long kind of prolonged traumatic emotional attack, essentially what it is. I would say kind of somatic safety is just recognizing you may have like hypervigilance when you exit these relationships. You may find yourself kind of panicking about some things that you may not be able to kind of put your finger on. So I would say kind of having some kind of basic somatic practice. So somatic is just a fancy word for the body, right? So just noticing what is going on in your body, going, oh, actually, my heart is racing here, or I have to make a phone call and I'm feeling a bit trembly, or my boss just said something and it reminded me of my ex-husband's, I feel like a clenching in my stomach. So just doing work to ease that over time. And I would say it's not difficult. This is where the breathing exercises come in, just having a practice of maybe meditation, just those really small things that seem as though they're not. I think sometimes we look at those and we think that's not going to like touch the sides, right? It's not going to help. How is a bit of breathing going to help me kind of calm down? But I would say, like, if we can make it a daily practice of checking in and breathing, or as we said before, like having some dance practice or yoga or swimming or walking, and maybe kind of meditating, something that just calms the body and lets us know that we're safe again. I think that's really important. So those four things: your environment, your emotions, having your infrastructure and network around you, and then doing something for your body as well. So we're not just also kind of mentally. One of the things I say is that you can't like think your way out of trauma. It has to go through the body at some point.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because there is those physical symptoms that come with it, and you have to be able to address that as well, and real conditions that can come from just the mental side of everything. It's just amazing how much your mentality can affect your entire body. It's just a whole fascinating world that I'm actually starting to really get into studying a little bit more. But it's just, yeah, you have to really put the intention into the body and calming the body, and it's incredible how doing that can just ease the mind, and it's just interesting how it's just all so connected, and just having the intention and educating yourself and continuing to do the work. And like you brought up, you're never at the end of your healing journey. You're going to continue to do this for the rest of your life. I don't know if that's necessarily unfortunate, but we evolve as we go through this process, and so I think that's the goal, is to continue to evolve, instead of having the end point of I'm healed from everything, because that's an impossible goal. We're never going to be there. But to have the goal of I'm going to evolve through this, and setting those intentions and doing that through these physical activities, and of course educating ourselves, by reading books like yours, and more, just continuing to go down the rabbit holes and figuring out what works for you is really what it's going to take to get there, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I would say celebrating and acknowledging, right? Acknowledging yourself,
Yeah.
celebrating yourself. You can do that as many times as you like, or in many pairs of shoes as you like.
Yep, absolutely. And always giving yourself credit for how far you've come too.
Yeah.
And don't ever compare yourself to somebody else's journey that they're on. It takes as long as it takes, and just keep going, because you're gonna get there. You'll get there. It just takes the time and the practice and the intention and the wanting to do it. Sticking with it.
Yeah, sticking with it it's possible to come through,
And,
to come through the other end.
Finding the right practices and the right people and finding your tribe is another huge important piece to it, I believe. And just getting the right pieces in place for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is a book that I read on my journey called The Awakened Brain, and it's by Lisa, and she talks about a framework actually for healing. And some of the components include some kind of spiritual practice, whether it can be a god, it can be a universe, it can be some kind of higher power that can be useful for people, or just kind of even positive thinking. Also getting out in nature and community as well. Those are really key pillars to healing.
Absolutely. You have to connect with that spirit or that soul piece in order for this to, to really get to where you want to be. You can't ignore that side of it. It doesn't matter what you subscribe to, as long as you're feeding that soul or that spirit somehow. Even if it's just those nature walks, connecting with a bird or a cat or something, but you have to be able to connect your soul. Without doing that, it's going to be really difficult. It's going to be really difficult without that piece. And so, yeah. Do you have any other advice for anybody going through these situations? Leaving narcissistic relationships or healing from them, or?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're leaving those relationships, there's a really big practical piece in terms of leaving. You may have to leave your home, you may have to change your financial setup, your childcare setup, etc. So it's to really get help and not do that alone, and to kind of strategize your way through that. But then I also think that you can keep yourself, it is actually quite amazing, I would say, how you can keep yourself safe, kind of emotionally safe, by just using some of those basic practices. So I would say if people are listening and have kind of never really got on board with the kind of breathing techniques, or just think it's too alternative, or it's just not going to work. I was a little bit like that, and I just didn't really make the connection with the body, and I would just power through, and I would read loads and listen to loads of podcasts, and I think my way through things. But in fact, if you can regulate yourself and just feel calm, if you can also kind of recognize what trauma response you might be having, if you're in the middle of an argument or something and thinking, right, I actually just want to get the hell out of here, or I want to fight back, or I just feel really immobilized. I think recognizing your trauma responses and being able to satisfy those in another way, and recognizing that you're having them, and then adapting and being able to soothe your nervous system, then that can actually help you get through kind of difficult times. Because if you do have arguments, etc., that are really unpleasant, or if your toxic partner is kind of continuing on like a rampage of criticism and nitpicking, etc., you're able to kind of self-soothe, and you'll feel yourself kind of getting your power back a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And that education piece is the biggest piece. Don't ever stop educating yourself on all of this, really. And the more that you know and understand, the better you're going to be able to help yourself through these situations. And being able to name what you're going through is a huge part of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also if people can stop and, as you said, name what's going on, then they may find that they're in the pattern, and then they can understand that they are actually in a toxic dynamic, and it's not just their relationship. They can see this is happening, gaslight is happening, like contempt is happening, or defensiveness, or going back to those 4 points, right? Or this stonewalling or the silent treatment is happening. And then they can think, oh, actually, that happened last Christmas. Oh, that happened on my birthday. Then women are more, and also men, are more likely to recognize they're in some kind of framework, and that will give them the wherewithal and a bit of information and data to understand what they're in.
Yeah, and this is where journaling really comes in to be really handy in identifying those patterns from the past, and well, that you're kind of going through right now too. But being able to just write it down and, you know, reflect on past experiences and situations, you know, is immensely helpful.
Yeah, I would say it's safe.
Yeah.
It's not always safe. So if you're keeping a journal or a handwritten journal, to maybe, you know, you could keep it in your car, in the boot of your car, or something like that. You can keep it maybe somewhere that it won't be found. You could keep voice notes phone or something like that, because it's not always safe necessarily to have our journals, etc., around. So just one caveat around that.
No, for sure. And, you know, you can always have, you know, locked notes in your phone and stuff like that too. But, you know, however you need to keep that. But, you know, being able to reflect on it is, you know, the key there, and
Absolutely.
noticing all of that. For sure. I love it. And I love everything that you've got going on your platform, and, you know, the book that you've written is just immensely helpful. And I recommend that everybody go out and buy the book, 21 Red Flags, Spotting the Signs of an Unhealthy Relationship, so that you can notice, you know, the things that are going on in your relationship that are not right for you, that, you know, you can overcome this toxicity in your life, and you can push past it, and it's possible. And educating yourself and reading more books and diving into the subjects is really what's going to get you there. And Romilly, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate all your expertise and your insights, and I know that you have helped many people today just by your conversation. And you know, again, I just thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
And where can everybody find you and get in touch with you?
Sure. So slightly unusual name, so I will spell it out. So my website is www.romilly, ROMILLY, Golding.com. So romillygolding.com. I do one-to-one coaching, and I'm opening up group coaching. So there's a contact page on my website if people just want to reach out or have a question. I have an offer for your podcast listeners, actually. So if they go to romillygolding.com/offer, then they will find like a discounted code there for one-to-one coaching, and then they'll also find the links to my book, etc., on there as well.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today, and letting the audience listen in. And I just love everything that you're doing, and wish you the best of luck on your journey. And yeah, thank you again so much. And everybody, thank you for tuning in and listening. And until next time, I love you guys. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.